Thank you so much, Trista, and your panelists for that inspiring and useful discussion. The next panel, as you mentioned, will focus on green coding and digital distribution and ask a big question. How can the way we make and digitally distribute games be more energy efficient? So please welcome to the virtual stage our chair for this discussion, Dan Wood, lead and co-author of the Green Games Guide. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you. Thank you. You've already introduced me. So as Jordan says, I am Ukie's Special Projects Lead and the co-author of the Green Games Guide, which is something we published earlier this year with Games London and Playing for the Planet. So yeah, a very warm welcome to our session on green coding and digital distribution. And again, to repeat what Jordan said, just what is that? What do we mean by green coding and digital distribution? It's essentially how mainly developers, but also publishers, tool, engine, network, and server providers can make and distribute games as energy efficient as possible. So it's quite an emerging area, but we think there's a real opportunity for the game sector to lead the thinking in this space. And we've got a couple of fantastic speakers to explore at least some of this theme in a little more detail. So you'll get to meet them in a minute, but we've got lined up for you. We've got Michael Esio, who's the founder of Africacomicade, and we've also got Rebecca Reed, who's director of electrical engineering at Xbox. Do you want to say a quick hi?
Hi.
Oscar's there. Hello. Yes. Anyway, I'll come back to you in a minute. So just before I turn to our speakers, I just wanted to give a bit of background and set the scene. So as I mentioned earlier this year, Ukie published our Green Games Guide. And when pulling this together, we became aware of research that was starting to show more evidence that the energy usage can vary from one game to the next, even those of similar genre and scale. And this suggested that developers and publishers and others I mentioned can start to think about the energy efficiency as part of development, as part of that, that integrated from the very beginning. And then when speaking to games businesses themselves and other experts, when we're writing the guide, it was clear that some are already thinking about this. And the way that games are coded, digitally stored and distributed can have an impact on the energy that is used when they're downloaded, streamed or played. So just to give you a sort of sense about what some of these areas were. So from games business said, they were looking at reusing assets from different versions of their games to avoid having multiple versions stored in different places. You can imagine, that builds up onto several kind of hard drives and servers all over the place, just saving the same assets. Why do we bundle up all our 4K or 8K assets as a default install when actually quite a big size of the player base doesn't need or use them? Things like minimizing the amount of processing power going into off-screen objects and avoiding having objects updating on every frame, so reducing calls on every frame wherever possible. So quite a few technical solutions are already happening. So we thought then, to move things forward a bit, we then held a green coding workshop to get a bigger group of games businesses together to discuss the topic further. And they thought even more ideas. And again, I just want to sort of turn it, because I think this is quite a broad area, but just to give you sort of more of a flavor about what we're talking about. So this is things like creating shared asset libraries for developers from multiple. There was a question about how could procedural generation of content and assets affect power output? Really interesting area from both a content and an energy saving point of view, obviously. There was some good discussion on data. Now, as games businesses, we capture and store and analyze sort of huge amounts of data, but what is the scale of that? And do we actually need it all? Do we honestly look at every bit of data we capture that we're storing? And it seems like an endless kind of stream of it literally coming in, and could we assess that? And things like, do menus and UIs need to run at 120 frames per second just because the games that they're part of do? So lots of kind of technical questions. There weren't many answers to this, and I think that's a point I wanted to make as part of this intro. There were other less technical questions raised too, but nonetheless, still pretty interesting. One of them, which is a bit of a conundrum, is the question that developers already optimize performance. Yeah, it's just part of what they do. It's part of the job. So will any energy saving actually just be eaten up by new features? That is a conundrum. Be good to get views on. Measurement. How do we get clear methodologies to measure any impact? There are some things that seem common sense that if you do one thing, it will have a impact on the energy use on the CPU and the GPU and other internals on the hardware. But what is the impact? Where should the focus be? Where's the best place to kind of divert attention to in that space? Is it rendering, or is it whatever it is? It could be various things. And interesting, there was also a very interesting discussion about what the consumer view of energy use in games was. And as an aside on this, there was a question raised in the same research that I mentioned earlier about how much performance players actually need. So this research found there was no correlation between the amount of enjoyment players had, and this is when they played the same game but just on different machines, and the performance level of the system they were using. So basically, they had as much fun playing the same game regardless of its performance and therefore energy usage. Now, this might seem contrary to some of the reviews that we all see for games that don't quite have the same right frame rate that people expect and so on. But nonetheless, it's worth thinking about. And then finally, just to return to some of the other questions that the workshop raised, how can we inspire more research into this as an industry? Is it an industry-wide competition, game jams, or funded R&D projects to investigate and accelerate our thinking? Or can we facilitate discussions to bring more relevant parties together? And finally, there was also a really interesting discussion about how more energy-efficient games mean wider device compatibility and therefore a wider global player base. We can't take for granted that our audience just has energy, unlimited energy access to 24 hours, 7 days a week. So I'll return to that bit that in a bit with Oscar, certainly. Anyway, so the conclusion of the workshop and of all that is that it's pretty complicated. There aren't many answers yet. It is an emerging area, but there was plenty of appetite to come up with some principles of green coding. But we needed to work to engage with the industry and answer more questions such as the ones above. So there is masses to cover, and so this is a good time to turn to our guests. So Oscar, are you there? Hello. Hi, Oscar. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hi.
Yes,
Oscar, do you want to just so it's a bit of time. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself and just say who you are, what you do, what Africacomicade is, and what Africacomicade does as well, please?
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Oscar Michael of Africacomicade. Africacomicade is basically a digital creative in the game and industry, games, comics, animation, etc. And what we do really is we're bringing these communities from all across the regions in Africa to connect, showcase their works as for collaboration, learning, and more.
Thank you. We had a few sound issues, but I think I can hear you okay now. So just a question for you. We first met at the Ukie's Green Coding Workshop that I mentioned earlier. And I just want to see if you could just give a bit more information about what the areas were that most stood out for you at that session.
Well, to start up with, I think it was very interesting. The games industry is really, really a huge business. Inside, most people still don't take it seriously. Being a business, we know it operations, activities in the games industry also affect our ecosystem. And it will see people in the industry, stakeholders in the industry, identify this issue and try to energy. The issue is not this region, but something that is global was interesting to see and fact my interest because we're in Africa, the market, we should jump on this as soon as possible.
Oscar, there's a bit of interference. I might turn to Rebecca just to see if the team can sort that out at all. We'll come back to you in a minute. Apologies, but I think we'll just see if we can sort that out and turn to Rebecca. Hi, Rebecca. Nice
Hello.
to see you. Hi, you can hear me, and there's no time lag.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. Hear you.
So just want to welcome you, and just want to introduce yourself, say who you are, what your role involves, and just give us sort of example of some of the work you've been doing in this space.
Yeah, sure. So I am a director of electrical engineering on the Xbox team at Microsoft. And basically what that means is I work with a team on the Xbox motherboard. And so we're really deep in the console design as a platform that, hosts games across many different types of studios. We're very focused on power reduction. That's part of one of the core design tenets that we have when we start designing consoles. So that's kind of what the team does directly. I've spent a lot of time at Microsoft working on many different products, from the Microsoft Surface to the Microsoft Fitness Band when that was a thing. And so this conversation of consumer electronics, the amount of power that they consume, and the carbon footprint of those products is something that is really close to hardware engineering right now.
Great, thank you. And so I think one of the key things in this debate is the interaction between kind of the code and the device. So and device architecture and design has a huge impact in this area, obviously. So how does console design fit into broadening kind of game sustainability conversations, and why is that design so important to climate change and sustainability generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it always helps to ground the audience when you're talking about carbon reduction in a little bit of the basics, right, around hardware design. So if we kind of go back to 2020, Microsoft made this big public commitment to be carbon negative by the year 2030. And that kind of immediately made the Xbox organization really deep dive into our product and our business. And in order to do that, we had to go right down to the root of our business, which is the console. And so we had to first figure out how to calculate the carbon footprint of the Xbox console. And then we had to go and figure out kind of some areas that we could go and hopefully reduce that carbon footprint. And I'll talk a little bit later, but you can predominantly do that through power reduction. So what we did, just to try to level set the audience, we chunked up the carbon footprint of the console into kind of three big areas. There's the manufacturing of the console, which is when we're putting it together at our factories. There's the distribution of those consoles worldwide to people, stores, people that want to use them. And then there's the usage of the console. And the usage is actually the thing with the Xbox that produces the most carbon out of that entire chain of development. And so the hardware team plays a big role in that usage number because we control the power budget of the console when we start designing a brand new console. And that power budget, just to give the audience like EE 101 here, that power budget is how we allocate wattage to different usages of the console. So one of the biggest ones that we look at is our standby power. When your console is kind of sitting, waiting for you to come back and play it, it needs to be able to update. It needs to be able to wake up when you turn your controller on. And as the hardware team, we try to look at how much power that sort of state needs and how we can go and reduce that now that we're looking at carbon footprint. The power mode that is most relevant to this audience is the gaming mode. And we, as a hardware team, intentionally design that mode to be our highest power mode. We want game developers to take full advantage of the hardware that we build. We're really excited each iteration of the console to build newer, more performant hardware. But what we're finding out is, in that high power gaming mode, we also are starting to affect our carbon footprint by providing that much power. And so the intersection here, is getting, into conversations with game developers, getting into conversations with the hardware team about how much of that power we can use in different, parts of game development.
Yeah, thank you. I'll come back to Oscar in a minute. I'll just ask you another question, Rebecca, if I can. So the game developers within this, they're sometimes quite far removed from kind of console design process, and as I say, they will just fill a GPU and CPU to its maximum capacity. But how can we, from your point of view, how can you shorten the distance and help drive some positive feedback between developers and console makers, and help drive down the energy efficiency?
Yeah, I think summits like this and conversations like this are a really great place to start. The the reality of hardware design is that the hardware teams start designing consoles and that power budget well before a game developer will get a console in hand. And often, we've locked in the hardware design before we can ever get any feedback from game developers. And so, we're really interested in shortening that feedback loop, pun intended, and making sure that we can start incorporating developer feedback about the different scenarios that they're looking to develop in the next generation, or, the different ways that they're thinking about utilizing the CPU and GPU. We really want to front load that information. So when my team goes and starts looking at new components or new technologies to incorporate into the next generation of consoles, we can potentially go after some power savings in the gaming mode that we wouldn't have had visibility into otherwise. And we can talk about some of the ways to do that. I think some of the things you mentioned in the kind of preamble to the conversation are really important to go investigate, especially on the game development side. When you're looking at how your game is rendering frames, if you need information about how much power that consumes, there could be an opportunity to calculate that, across the platform. Or if you're developing, a menu or, a scene, and you're wondering, if I do it with this tool in the game engine or that tool in the game engine, is one more efficient, is one not more efficient? I think there's a future where we could, potentially help out if we bring those conversations and those teams together.
Yeah, thank you. And how possible is it at the moment to kind of measure that kind of level of granularity for things like rendering or frame rate, changing frame rates? We've had a question. I'm not sure we can really answer it, but about games that have huge amounts of content generally and things like that. How can you how possible is it to kind of measure that to that level of granularity?
Yeah, I would say at scale right now, not possible. We haven't yet reached the point in this conversation and this technology where we can kind of provide that information real time. On the hardware team side, because we are trying to design for those huge games, or there's those games that are a big workload on our system, in the lab, we can go and measure power output of that game. And I would say, game developers could also go into a lab scenario and make power measurements on their game, and get at least a rough estimate of, how each frame or how each part of the game is producing power on the console. But that is one of the big areas that I think, is the future of carbon reduction in the gaming industry, is trying to help, provide data in those types of decisions and questions.
Amazing. I might return back to that, Rebecca, but thank you very much. I believe Oscar is now stable. I've had a message. So Oscar, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
That's better. Hello. Right. Do you want to just, I'm not sure people really got, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly again and what Africacomicade does as well?
Yeah. Okay, my name is Oscar Michael, and I'm the co-founder of Creatives. Can you hear me, please?
Yeah, it's a bit choppy, but we'll persevere for a bit.
So that's a platform for African digital creatives in the games and entertainment. Okay. Sorry about the internet issue. Yeah, so that's for a platform for African creatives in the games, animation, comics, and entertainment industry. Put them together, opportunities for collaboration, for learning, as well as for co-creation.
Yeah, thank you. And again, so one of the things I just one of the things that you came to our round table, and you then held a similar session yourself with your community. And I know that for some players, having access to unlimited electricity and bandwidth isn't possible, and this is something you discussed. So can you tell us a bit more about this and the conversation you had at your meeting, particularly about energy usage, opening up wider player bases, and the challenges your community faces with sometimes limited access to power?
Yes, so that power is a big challenge on this side. What you come to see from the discussions we have with most, they've come to agree that is a big issue. And discussing more about energy to improve the efficiency makes serious business sense. Um, as you can see right now, I'm also having some issues with the internet and all. And these are some of the things that face a majority of the studios on these regions. So discussions like this, from the discussion we had at the workshop, people discuss, we get much more resources because this affects their deadlines, this affects their, and so basically looking at opportunities and ways to tackle these. Yeah.
Thank you. And what sort of tools would you and your community like to see, or information, in fact, tools or information that your community like to see to help make games more energy efficient?
When you put it that way, the thing is, green coding, for example, is something very tricky. There's still lots of people on this side that they feel like they don't have time right now to bother about efficiency, energy efficiency, and the likes. Because, like I said earlier on, like I made mention of, Africa is an emerging market when it comes to games and all, and a huge focus is on the business side, making money. So that's really funny. But then there are people that really take this serious. There are people that have come to see the need as a business to be sustainable in their approach. And they're clamoring for much more support. They're clamoring for solutions. We need to engage these people because now we have an opportunity to ensure that we don't make the mistakes already made in far developed areas. You get the idea. So we can engage these studios in discussions. We need to bring up data to prove that this is real, this is the situation on the ground, and these are the implications in place. We also need to organize much more workshops that can bring them together to understand their problem, that can bring people together to show them new solutions, because talk is not just what is going to really help. We need to engage these people. We need to make them see the problem, as well as together co-create a solution for the problem. And yeah, I think these are some of the most important things we need to do right now.
Thank you very much, Oscar. It's great to have a different perspective on this. I'll come back to you in a minute. Rebecca, I'll turn back to you. So generally, Microsoft as a company is obviously committed to being carbon negative by 2030, which is a big pledge and a big commitment. And what role does Xbox and the Xbox kind of division, as it were, play in that commitment? And how, can developers, come back to the developers, what part can they play in achieving that goal?
Yeah, so the Xbox role is really central to that commitment that Microsoft has made. If you think about the millions and millions of Xboxes that are currently plugged into a wall, drawing power from power grids around the world, that's a really big opportunity to reduce the carbon footprint just through being more efficient on the Xbox platform. And obviously game developers, studios, game engines play a huge part in that mission. Right now, I think the big power savings come from component selections, as I discussed before, right? So designing silicon more efficiently, designing power states on the motherboard more efficiently. But in between these kind of big generational releases, game developers get an opportunity to start chipping away at some of the power consumption, kind of in between those years of big console releases. And we've heard back from some studios and some game developers that this seems to be one thing to add to their list of things to do is, I already look at performance. I'm already trying to optimize my game. Isn't thinking about sustainability or power efficiency kind of just one more task to look at? And I would kind of answer that question and say it is. And that's kind of the joy of being an engineer in this space right now, is we have kind of a new design metric coming into our day-to-day work that we get to goal ourselves against. And that doesn't happen often in the engineering world, where you get to make big impact in a new area. And those are the types of challenges that get the Xbox engineers excited, and I hope gets the audience excited about reducing power on the console in a new, unique way. I think over the next few years, we're going to see a lot of conversation around, how games are developed, the size of games, where in a game do we need to use that max performance and where can we ramp it back? How do we create tools that are giving you a better insight into power efficiency? And those conversations are just getting going right now, but game developers are going to play a critical role in defining the metrics and the requirements for that suite of tools.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as I said, in the session we held, there was a real appetite to construct what we were sort of calling for now principles of green coding. And we got as far as some of the concepts that we discussed earlier. But do you think, sounding what you described there, that's similar, do you think that that's possible to kind of instill that, some hopefully some light touch principles at an early stage? And do you think it's possible to produce something like that fairly soon, or do we need to get measurement in place first? I mean, how far off do you think something like that would be?
No, I think principles can happen immediately. And then we can, produce measurement that help enforce those principles. One of the things we did on the console side was, we said we want to lower our power in our carbon production in the console, or our carbon footprint in the console. That was kind of our principle. And then we had to go through and take a kind of a rough whack at trying to calculate the carbon footprint of the console. And we got better at it as we did it, right? And so I think, not setting the goal because you don't have the data isn't the right way to be moving forward, right? Set that big goal and then, learn through the process of trying to achieve that goal instead of saying like, oh, it's too hard, I can't, and I would just like to double down on, we at Xbox, take pride in the high performance consoles that we want game developers to use them to their full potential. But we believe you can do that, and we can be, conscious of power efficiency as something that we can play with, on a spectrum when you're developing a game. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now, and I think, I think getting those tools in place is definitely the next step.
Thank you. And just briefly, we're going to sort of wrap up in a minute. Oscar, you still there?
Yes, I am.
Hi. I just wonder if you have any views on that question around kind of the consumer's role in this. And we've had a question asking about, shouldn't we also question, graphical styles, length of games, and so on. And of course, that there should be games for everyone and all tastes. But do you think there is an audience appetite in your community and in Africa for less energy hungry games that can be produced that still are just as much fun, that reach a wider demographic then?
Yes, I think there is a huge appetite. One good place to look at also is if you look at the way, mobile gaming is huge on this side as compared to console or any form of gaming. And so there is a demand for that. If you can make it as interactive as fun as possible, there is a demand. And on the creator side as well, the developers themselves, they're also looking out for ways, because development is actually very expensive on this side. Developers struggle with resources, from power to making those high-end graphics that tends to attract the global audience. And if we can find ways to actually reduce this cost, that would really help boost the market on this side.
Yeah, great. Well, I think, hoping to say that the short-term ambitions try and produce some principles of green coding that can start to develop into more kind of measurable and tangible ways of reducing energy usage, and opening up games to a bit more people and making it easier for people to make games, then that can only be a good thing. We're going to wrap up there, but thank you ever so much for your time. I'd like to thank Rebecca and Oscar. I'm glad we got there in the end, Oscar. We can hear you loud and clear now, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, so look, thanks very much for your time, and thank you to the audience for listening. I hope that was interesting for you.